Welcome ICRE 2015. Welcome to beautiful Vancouver. Thank you to those of you who are UBC faculty and residents. We love your city, it's gorgeous. We'll take it home with us. Okay, I saw somebody on Twitter today say they did something called the grouse grind, which is basically running up one of the local mountains. Is that person here? You did it. We gotta give a hand to this guy. He ran up a mountain. Stand up. It's a local tradition, and it's also a post-con. You can sign up for it. You can't, I'm joking. My name's Jason Frank. I'm the chair of the 8th International Conference on Residency Education. And it's my privilege to be here with our team of people who've been working for a year to plan this great event. Many of you were with us over the last few years at other ICRE events, and this one's particularly special. We're really excited to have you here. We have a number of wonderful events, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about them in the next few minutes. It's going to be jam-packed. How many of you, just to make a little bit of noise, attended one of the pre-con events over the last 2 days? All right. I hope you found that really useful. I hope you took away something that changed your practice in medical education. Maybe you met somebody new that's going to be somebody you work with and keep up virtually with. Maybe you took on a new project and a new idea. As I say, we're excited to have you join us. There's about 2,000 medical educators from around the world. This year we have 35 countries where residency education occurs. We prepare people for practice, and ultimately we prepare people to serve the societies that we're training our graduates for. And that's kind of our sacred task that we're given. So can I ask, if you in the audience are a program director or equivalent, you're a training director of residency education, can you please stand up? This conference is really for you. Thank you for doing what you do. This year's theme is rediscovering residency education. And the intent behind that theme when the planning board chose it was we have this sense in the air that there's a change coming to the way we prepare physicians for practice. We have lots of interesting data that is emerging that perhaps there's a better way. So at this conference over the next 2 days, we're going to be talking about a number of these radical different ways of training, competency-based, some other interesting models. You're going to hear all about them, and I really hope you enjoy them. Some of them you might find challenging. Some of them you might say, I could never do that in my home program. But maybe a few of them will give you an idea to consider the future. The future of medical education is definitely here for the next couple of days, and it starts with you. I would now like to invite my colleague and my dear friend and president of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada, Dr. Kevin Imrie, to say a few words of welcome.
Thanks so much, Jason. As president of the Royal College, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 2015 International Conference on Residency Education. À titre de président du Collège Royal, j'ai l'immense plaisir de vous accueillir à la conférence internationale sur la formation des résidents de 2015. We at the Royal College are really immensely pleased to be hosting this year's ICRE in this amazing city. While ICRE officially starts today, many of you have been here for a little while yet and participated in the pre-conference workshops, including the International Medical Education Leaders Forum and the MedEd Summit and the Program Administrators Conference. These sessions really focused on the transformations that medical education is undergoing and help to set the stage for the innovative program that lies ahead for you over the next couple of days. As Jason mentioned, ICRE was first launched in 2008 to really be focusing uniquely on residency education on an international scale. And it's been so satisfying to see just how this conference has grown over the past 7 years. It's grown exponentially. with participation from a diverse number of countries, with 35 countries from a variety setting around the world. As Jason noted, there are a great number of topics being discussed this year, all that relate to this concept of transformation within medical education and how it influences patient care. From competency-based medical education, resident duty hours, various cutting-edge tools and practical techniques. And we really hope that the conference really helps to spark innovative conversations about how to move this forward and how we can really revolutionize training in the future. So as we delve into this year's theme, Residency Rediscovered, Transforming Training for Medical Care, I hope that you'll find inspiration in the dynamic speakers, including David Ash that you'll be hearing from shortly, the presentations, workshops, and also the really uniquely valuable networking opportunities that happen in the hallways and between the sessions. And I really encourage you to be thinking about how you can take this information and apply it back in your home clinical practice and education settings. So for those of you on the front line of medical education, we must become partners in advancing our profession, which is why it's important for us to leverage new technologies and implement new strategies. And you'll be hearing this year about the large-scale refresh that we've done to the CanMeds 2015 framework this year. And I encourage you to learn about these various initiatives, and in particular to get a chance to visit the Royal College booth in the exhibit hall where you can learn more about it. I want now to personally thank each and every one of you for being part of this year's ICRE. You as participants are a key part in contributing to the success of our conference, and I really hope that your experience over the next 3 years will be very productive and inspirational. Encore une fois, je vous remercie de participer à l'événement de cette année. It's now my pleasure to welcome you back, Jason, back to the stage to share some of the details about this year's conference and to introduce this year's plenary lecturer. Jason? Thank you, Kevin.
So before we get into the details about some features into this year's program, which we've been working so hard on for a year, we're very excited to share it with you. Let's just take a moment to think about why we are here. Are there residents in the audience? Can you please stand up, residents? Thank you for being the next generation in our profession, and we'd like to celebrate having you amongst us as well. I think the ultimate outcome of a residency program is to create a colleague who is even smarter than any one of us who are so dedicated to educating them. It's a rewarding enterprise to be a part of. It's a really important function in our societies, and every year we learn how to do it better and better. This forum was created so that all of us didn't have to reinvent the wheel. We have similar challenges around the world, and this is the forum to share ideas and new exciting developments to keep on making our programs better. About a year ago, John Charbonneau and I published a paper called At Sir Bill, and it was really about, if Sir William Oser was alive today, we think he'd be on Twitter. We think, like many of the medical educators in the room, that they'd be sharing social media and innovations that way, and this is a Twitter-friendly conference. We want you to encourage you to please make this a worldwide conversation. In that paper, we also said, though, that if Sir William Osler, a classic giant in creating residency education as we know it about 100 years ago, if he was teleported today to your program, he would look around and be amazed at the technology present. Things that beep, amazing imaging, wonderful technology and materials we have to work with in the healing of patients. But if he followed you on a ward round and watched you do teaching, he'd be right at home. We haven't really changed our educational methods in a long time. So maybe we should look at where we've come from.
My name is Seelan Parekh. I'm an associate professor of orthopedic surgery at Duke Orthopedics. Okay, Glass, record a video. Back in October, I obtained my first pair of Google Glass and played around with it for a little bit in the operating room. But then in January, when I went to India for our charitable work, that's when I started to realize the true power of wearable technologies in healthcare. From India, it got broadcast throughout the world. 15,000 to 20,000 people tuned in to the surgery. It started to allow me to realize that this could really be a tool versus just a cool gadget that's nice to wear.
Can you tell me more about that sinus infection?
I have had sinus congestion, post-nasal drip, and a pain in my face for 3 days.
Usually it's just doctors and nurses looking on. Today, it's an audience of thousands online, following it all in real time.
Thank you. So our educational technology is evolving. And just as an aside, the guy there, he was a bit tachycardic and he was a little bit pale. He also looked a bit plasticky. Those of us who are planning this conference, and think about it for months before you arrive, we will be satisfied if you leave here with something that's really impacted your practice. So our goal is not just to have a great time together, enjoy beautiful Vancouver, drink a lot of Starbucks. Our goal is to change your practice. We want to build on our work from previous years and take that forward. So here's some of the features we have in store for you. Our program is very dynamic. It's meant to be very practical and maybe a little bit edgy. You'll see that when our first speaker comes up, maybe make you a little uncomfortable and help you see your own program a little bit differently. This year we have 200 paper and poster presentations selected by our planning committee after a review, 15 different learning tracks, and more than 50 workshops. So you'll have a huge variety to choose from. Tomorrow morning we'll begin with the Residency Rediscovered panel. And we've selected and scoured the world for people who are doing something a little bit different with residency education. Meet Assam Albanian from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Meet Eric Warm, an innovator in Cincinnati. Meet Mike Donoff, who's from Edmonton nearby, and the cool things he's doing with their assessment system. Meet Markku Nuusinainen from Toronto and the really interesting competency-based U of T orthopedics program. This will be hosted by co-chair of the conference, Fiona Moss, and it'll help us consider radical new training models. On Saturday, we'll do the official launch of CanMeds 2015, hosted by my colleague and co-chair, Linda Snell. It'll feature Dr. Mary Louise Stokes from Australia, Fede Schiel from the Netherlands, Kelly Kaverzagi from the US, all reacting to the idea of competency frameworks and their pros and cons. And myself, I'll be presenting the findings of the CanMeds 2015 development process. That's on Saturday morning. Saturday morning is also this debate, which is not to be missed. In the blue corner, meet Professor Eric Hombo, a giant in medical education, and he's going to be doing the pro position on competency-based medical education. And then in the red corner, meet the other giant, Dr. J. Mark Walton, postgraduate dean in Canada, surgical leader, educator, and they'll be going head-to-head. I understand they'll have color-coordinated uniforms. The host will be John Sherbino, and he's told me he's warmed up both athletes, and they'll come out swinging. In fact, I've seen some trash talk on Twitter as well. Saturday afternoon, meet these two amazing leaders. Dr. Helen Bevan is flying in from the UK where she is in charge of change management in the national health system. She's always trying to help the NHS to innovate and world recognized in that process. And Captain John Cox is joining us, and he's been an innovator in the airline industry, and he's going to bring all of those ideas on how to change your program, how to make medical education even better. That'll be hosted by Kelly Kavarzagi. A couple other new features. We talked about the pre-conference sessions we had. We had the competency-based medical education course for the last couple of days. How many of you attended the e-log and e-portfolio pre-con? 2 people, okay, that's good. I know it was a big success, and I thank you. I hope it was amazing. We have a new mentorship program that we're launching here at ICRE 2015. If you have an idea that you'd like to run by a medical education guru, if you'd like to talk about your future career in medical education, we have a sign-up process at registration. And these are amazing people. Perhaps you'd just like to talk to them about some of their publications and meet with them. They very generously have signed up. Their bios are in the program and at the desk. We've also launched something new called lightning rounds. So in 45 minutes, we're going to introduce an educator's perspective on a topic, like competence committees, career tracks as a medical educator, how to use social media. So we would like to hear how that goes. As always, we have the International Resident Leadership Summit. We have so many wonderful resident leaders here, and they have their own dedicated track within ICRE this year. And the feature, as always, is Resident Survival Stories, which is an amazing panel. Everyone's welcome to go to that session if you're interested. Residents talk about the hardships that they might have experienced in a unique way and the lessons they've learned for us all. I hope you can stay on until Saturday evening, where you can meet this guy, Glenn Rager, who actually lives here in Vancouver, and he's a world guru in medical education, wonderful publications. He's also a wonderful speaker, always impactful, will always change the way you view the world. And his topic is kids these days, reconsidering our conversations about generations. And right before that, Linda Snell, who happens to be the co-chair of this conference, a clinician educator and internist, she's also a sommelier. So she's brought together a collection of Canadian wines, and she tells me they're amazing. And if you would like to learn about Canadian wine, she's designed a session called Physician as Wine Lover. After you've had a lot of wine, you may want some exercise. Actually, before that session, each morning we've booked a yoga instructor, and it's sold out so quickly. Everybody who signs up, by the way, you get a free yoga mat from ICRE that you can take home and just lie on if you want to. Apparently it's going to be amazing. It's an amazing instructor from Vancouver. And in the afternoon will be, once again, exercise with educators running around beautiful downtown Vancouver. I mentioned social media. Last year we had a social media summit that John Charbonneau hosted, and that produced a series of papers about the intersection of social media and medical education. John's back and has agreed to be our Twitter and social media advisor-in-chief for this conference. He'll be selecting from all of your tweets and posts on the web the coolest installments, and we'll be posting that every day. If you haven't already downloaded the app, I encourage you to do so. I'd just like to conclude that we who are on the planning board from all the countries around the world who set up this conference are so excited to have you here and pleased to have you here, that you could join us this year in Vancouver. Hope you enjoy the next 3 days. Without further ado then, allow me to introduce our keynote speaker, the opening speaker of our conference, Dr. David Ash. Let me tell you a little bit more about him. David Ash is the Executive Director of the Penn Medicine Center for Healthcare Innovation, which just sounds like a really cool job. He's Professor of Medicine and Professor of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the Perelman School of Medicine, and Professor of Healthcare Management, and Professor of Operations and Information Management at Wharton School. Your business card must be really long, David. He's Director of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Clinical Scholars Program at the University of Pennsylvania. David tells me over dinner last night that he actually interacts a lot with other health services researchers and a lot of economists, which really brings a unique view to our profession and to the outcomes of our medical education system. You're about to hear about that. And I think it might surprise you and maybe shake your boots. Dr. Ash teaches health policy at the Wharton School, and he practices internal medicine at the Philadelphia Veterans Affairs Medical Center, where he created, from 2001 to 2012, and directed the Center for Health Equity Research and Promotion. A number of innovations in David's career already. By the way, when I took David, we went for dinner last night, and I opened the conversation and said, so David, tell me about yourself. Where'd you come from? What's an early event in your life? And he said, my APGARs were 8 and 9. Dr. Ash's research aims to understand and improve how physicians and patients make medical choices in clinical, financial, and ethically charged settings, including the adoption of new pharmaceuticals or medical technologies, the purchase of insurance, and personal health behaviors. His research combines elements of economic analysis, psychological theory, so kind of behavioral economics, and marketing in the field now called behavioral economics. He's the author of more than 250 published papers and has received numerous teaching awards. David Ash is my new favorite health services researcher. He has a unique view on our enterprise. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. David Ash.
Well, thank you, Jason, for that tremendous introduction. I am totally thrilled to be here and so honored that you're all here, and particularly in this incredibly beautiful city. So let me thank you for allowing me to speak with you for a few minutes. I have a few disclosures and a few other disclosures. So first, a little quiz here. You can just shout this out. Think of a brand name product. Kodak. I heard Kodak. Great. So that's exactly what I meant. Now, I set up this slide about 3 or 4 years ago because Kodak went bankrupt. And I made this slide to show to my children who were then in their late teens, early 20s. And I wanted to see if they could guess the brand. Because Kodak went bankrupt, its stock price dropped to almost nothing, and I thought, it's got to come back. And my kids could not identify the brand. And so I was worried, since they're the future, I shouldn't invest in the stock. I was going to do that. Now, it was a crazy idea anyway, because, of course, physicians are absolutely the worst stock pickers of them all. But that had been my chance to check out whether there was a future for Kodak. And in fact, it has reinvented itself. I will say that I tried this same slide out at the Association of American Medical Colleges meeting, Council of Deans. And so that's a meeting that's held in the spring only for the deans of U.S. medical school. So I was presenting, and so I asked this question, think of a brand name product, and someone in the back yells out, Starbucks. Now I just want, if you're in that room and you're not me, you're a dean of a U.S. medical school, and so nothing made me despair more about the future of medical education than that particular answer. So I bring this up because Kodak, there are probably many reasons why it went bankrupt, but one reason is that it was late to recognize that it was in what business it was in. Kodak thought that it was in the camera and film business, but in fact it was in the imaging business. And there's a lesson from the world of marketing, which is that it is always much better to define your business by what your customers want rather than what it is that you produce. And so the prediction that I have, or maybe it's the hope that I have, is that hospitals and doctors should leave the healthcare business and soon enter the health business, because health is what patients want. Health is the goal, the single purpose that justifies what is truly an extraordinary investment in medical education is improving the health of individuals and populations. That is the goal. So I want to tell 2 stories here and have 2 themes. The first is the case for health rather than just health care. And the second that I'll spend more time on is the case for a customer-focused system of evaluation in residency education. And I think both of these reflect a move from what we produce to what it is that people want, a move from a production orientation to a customer orientation. How many of you recognize these characters? Just raise your hand or something. Just a little test of popular culture here. Okay, so these are two characters from the TV show Downton Abbey. They're two well-dressed men. They live in the same house in the same Edwardian era. They share the same cook, share a taste in wine, and I'll pose the rhetorical question, which one has the longer life expectancy? And it's going to be Lord Grantham. Actually, it's a trick question. Those of you who watch this series know that the characters are constantly dropping off from preeclampsia and other conditions. But the reason that Lord Grantham, in theory, has the much longer life expectancy is because social status contributes more to people's life expectancy than pretty much anything. And probably the classic story for this comes from the Whitehall study, in which it was demonstrated that civil service grade largely determines your mortality. This was a study of over 18,000 British civil servants who were middle-aged. They were followed for a minimum of 25 years, and although I won't go over the slide in detail, for every age period, mortality was substantially higher from the lower socioeconomic groups, and that was true even if you adjusted for things like tobacco use or blood pressure or smoking, which contributed a tiny amount to the overall variance in life expectancy. Social status tremendously determines your health and your life expectancy. Here's another slide. This is the annual incidence of pneumococcal bacteremia by age. And anybody in this audience shouldn't be surprised to know that we see an increase in pneumococcal bacteremia with age. We all have a medical model for why that might be the case. Here's the same annual incidence of pneumococcal bacteremia based on race, based on education, and based on annual household income. And for annual household income, I actually had to change the scale of the slide to make it fit. Nothing in our understanding of germ theory can help us understand what it is about race or education or annual household income that gets the pneumococcus into your bloodstream. And it just shows that germ theory is a relatively tiny part of what explains important health outcomes. The outcomes that we care about, all of us, arise as much really from the social and economic forces that shape health and healthcare as they do from fundamental cellular and molecular processes. So some colleagues and I came up with a concept of watching over what we call the other 5,000 hours. And the point here is that even patients with a chronic illness might spend only a few hours a year in front of a doctor or a nurse or in a hospital, but they spend the remaining 5,000 plus waking hours a year doing everything else in their life. And it's during those other 5,000 hours that so many of the determinants of their ultimate health outcomes, the outcomes we fundamentally care about, play out. And yet doctors, nurses, hospitals don't have a way to know what their patients are doing during that period of time. And even if they did, there aren't actually great mechanisms to engage with patients during the 5,000 hours that represent their daily living. Here's an example of a project we did at the Innovation Center at Penn, in which we actually followed some patients home after they were discharged. In this case, it was a patient who had been discharged and then readmitted with congestive heart failure to see what's going on in their lives. And actually, we learned a tremendous amount. I'll call this patient Mrs. Jones, so I don't have a privacy violation. But she had done a bunch of things. She had put on her refrigerator a list of warning signs for when to call the doctor, because in fact she hadn't realized that the cough she had developed was a sign perhaps that she had more pulmonary vascular congestion. She created this big sheet to help improve her medication compliance, and then she photocopied that and sent it to her adult children. She relabeled her pills at the top of the bottles with information that was much simpler for her to use compared to the tiny little labels that were on the side of the bottle, in which the frequency and the dose was in a font actually smaller than some other things that were far less important. And then she had a list of paper, a piece of paper in which she had listed some foods that she wanted to try that were low in sodium. And I bring this up because it's only by going into people's houses, and I'm not advocating that we all do house calls, although maybe I should be advocating that, but it does reveal that it's the 5,000 hours that tells us so much more about our patients' health than the kinds of things that we experience within the hospital. And I see this in many ways as medical education's opportunity to lean in, right? In the past, education has largely followed doctors into their sites of practice, but really hasn't followed patients who are its main customers. And so I can think of where doctors are and where patients are as part of this model. And I can see that as moving from a production orientation to a customer orientation. I thought that was pretty cool. Want to see that again? Thank you. What was not as cool as the video that Jason showed, but still, it was something. So let me come back to the case for a customer-focused system of evaluation in residency education. So here's the business model of photography that I think led in part to the demise of Kodak, at least Kodak as a photography company. What Kodak did was focus on cameras, film, and paper. This was the production process of Kodak. What people want was output, in this case, images or memories, right? So in fact, I think the real future is, like, when I think about what do people want from their photographs, I think they want shareable visual memories. Like, so maybe the future is some kind of Bluetooth-enabled chip that's implanted in your hippocampus or something like that. Maybe that's going to replace digital imaging in the future. But it certainly wasn't cameras, film, and paper. And Kodak pretty much dropped off the stock market. Here's the business model for medical education. What all of us in this room do, and it's very important to do, is focus on medical education. But really, that is the production process. What customers want is health and healthcare. And the theme of what I want to talk about today is how do we move from the production process to the output? How do we focus on, are we delivering to customers what it is they want, and use that as our system for judging whether we've been successful or not? So this is a theme that's existed in the medical quality literature for quite some time, and I'll draw some allusions to that. We often think about processes and outcomes, and before that we think about structures. The processes are, did the patient with acute MI receive aspirin? Did I order colorectal cancer screening? But of course the outcomes we care about is, did the patient with AMI survive? Did the patient get colorectal cancer screening? Or more importantly, did they avoid colorectal cancer? There are so many lessons from the quality improvement literature that reveal how challenging a move from process to outcomes can be. And so I think it is a stressful move. I also don't think it's the thing we should do exclusively. There's a role for process and a role for outcomes. When you focus on process, you put much more in providers' control. It requires less adjustment for other variables, right? It should be just as easy to give aspirin to a sick person as a healthy person, a rich person, a poor person. It's more easily regulated. I can regulate the delivery of aspirin. I can't regulate survival. It can usually be evaluated in real time, and it doesn't scare providers away from those who most need them. Whereas a focus on outcomes is closer to what people care about. It often needs adjustment for other variables because, as I just mentioned, our social circumstances determine our health. It often requires high volumes because the event rates for outcomes are much lower, so statistically, you don't get resolution. It often requires waiting for those outcomes, many, many years sometimes. But it does encourage more effort towards harder or needier cases who are going to need more effort to get to the better outcomes. And so you can think about processes like cameras, film, test scores, competencies, experiences, sleep, the sleep of residents, how doctors practice, and you could think of outcomes, images, memories, good doctors, good healthcare, good health, low cost, the kinds of things that patients need. And that's the process outcome distinction that I see in industrial fields, in quality fields, and in education. And here's another argument for focusing on outcomes. When you focus on process alone, it really does limit innovation because you lock up the process. You say, these are the things you need to do to have an accredited residency program in surgery, in psychiatry, in pediatrics. And when you lock the processes, you get what you get. But if instead we had confidence about what it was that we were trying to produce, it might invite far more innovation because we could let 1,000 flowers bloom and you'd be judged on whether you got there or not. And we could find new models for medical education, whether that was residency training or any other parts of training. As fields mature, they generally move closer to measuring outcomes, or it becomes more of the balance. So early education research and early education effectiveness was really measured by structural elements like curriculum. We're very much focused on competencies now. Patient outcomes is a relatively new area. And again, it follows the structure, process, outcome model that has been espoused for healthcare quality for more than 3 decades, really 4 decades now. So let's come back concretely to residency. And I'll ask a simple question. What should we mean if we say that a residency program is good? Or what should we mean if we say that one residency program is better than another? And the point I want to put forth is, if the goal of residency training is improving the health of individuals and populations, then good programs, good residency programs, are those that produce doctors that take care of patients well. And better programs, if you want to be comparative about it, are those that produce graduates who take care of patients better. That's the model I want to put forth. And of course, there's more to residency training than just patient outcomes, but it probably is number one for most programs. So here's a business model of obstetrics. I'm a general internist, actually. But the model, I'm going to talk about obstetrics for the next few minutes. I know Jason already mentioned what my APGAR scores were. So here's what OBGYN residencies do, right? They think about how should we train obstetricians. But what people want, let's say you're a woman who is going to deliver a baby, is how should I choose an obstetrician? You want a good obstetrician. So a bunch of colleagues and I have done several studies looking at obstetrics, which has been a very good model for us in thinking about residency education. It's cheating a little bit because it has some characteristics that make it easier to do what I'm going to describe for obstetrics that are not so easy to do for other fields. With all due respect to obstetrics, it's a relatively narrow field. Obstetricians largely deliver babies. They may also do gynecology. It's a relatively high volume field. If you're delivering babies, you tend to deliver a lot of them. There's no great need for severity adjustment, right? Most of your patients are healthy young women. There are of course, high-risk pregnancies, but most of your patients are healthy young women. And the outcomes are largely attributable to a single physician, although there may be others in laborist models of care, and you might have an anesthesiologist, and there might be labor and delivery nurses and the like. This work that I'm going to describe, though, is not attributable to a single person. I had a bunch of colleagues. Andrew Epstein is a health economist at Penn. Sean Nicholson is a health economist at Cornell. Jeff Herron is a statistician at Yale. And Sindhu Srinivas actually is the only member of our team who is an obstetrician from the University of Pennsylvania. And here's the model that we used to think about patient outcomes. We have patient outcomes all the way on the right, and I think that they are determined in part by physician ability and also a few other things, certain patient characteristics and the resources and environment in which the patient is and the physician is. But physician ability, we want to believe, has some contribution to patient outcomes. And physician ability itself in this model is probably a product of three things. It's probably a product of training there in the middle, physician experience down at the bottom, and physician aptitude up at the top. That's the simple model, and I want to explore each of these in turn. If all that matters about your quality and how well you can create patient outcomes is where you trained, then let's say you trained at the University of Ottawa, and that's an incredibly good place, and then your quality is totally determined by where you trained. And if you trained at a lesser place, your quality is totally determined by that for the rest of your career. I'm not saying that's the case, but that's what you're saying if all that matters is where you trained. If all that matters is your experience, and your experience increases over time, then you should just get better and better, like in the middle panel. And if all that mattered is how you started, which is what I'm going to use as a model for physician aptitude, then it looks like the first of those panels, which is how you start determines how you end. Now, what's important about this is that the first two of these are actually easily observable by customers. Your patients could find out where you trained, and they could figure out how much experience you have. So it's actually very customer-focused if those turn out to be important variables. And the answer to these might also provide some direction to new training approaches. So does where you trained matter? I would say that almost everyone in this room probably thinks so, right? It's highly intuitive. Medical students aim to get accepted into certain residencies. Physicians brag about their residencies, right? Health systems give preferential hiring to people who went through prestigious training programs. But these might all be empty signals, right? What is the evidence that where you trained actually matters? So here's what my colleagues and I did. We looked at hospital deliveries in Florida and New York, two very large states in the United States. For about 15 or 16 years, this was 7 million deliveries. We looked at about 5 million of these that are available from state-mandated hospital discharge records. And we examined those deliveries from licensed physicians who completed OB residency training and had done at least 100 deliveries. And we only looked at those who came from residency programs that contributed a fair number of these physicians. Remember, these are not just residency programs in Florida or New York, right? You could go to do a residency program in Texas and end up practicing in Florida and New York. And in the end, we had 107 of the roughly 250 residency programs that exist in the United States. And here's what we found. We looked at maternal complication rates. Obviously, in obstetrics, you care about what happens to the baby and you care about what happens to the mother. We didn't, and I apologize, didn't have any data about the baby's outcomes. But we did have outcomes about the mothers, and complication rates are actually reasonably high at around the 13 to 15% range in general. They include things like laceration, infection, hemorrhage, whether it's a vaginal or a cesarean delivery. You can have operative complications from the cesarean. And what we found is that there are substantial and stable differences in complication rates across programs. So if you're in the top quintile, you had a complication rate of about 10.3%, and in the bottom quintile, almost 14%. That's a huge difference in absolute terms. In the US, there are over 4 million deliveries a year. And these were consistent in the program and stable, and they were also stable across vaginal and cesarean deliveries and stable across the various kinds of complications that can be associated with those deliveries. So a residency program that tends to produce doctors that have low rates of laceration following a vaginal delivery does that consistently, and also produces doctors who have low rates of operative complications following a cesarean delivery. And this is adjusted for all sorts of comorbidities and hospital characteristics. What occurred to us is perhaps this is selection. Right? Perhaps some residency programs are better at producing better doctors because they're better at attracting better medical students into their residency. Do programs have better outcomes because of something they do to the residents or because of selection? Now remember, if you're a patient, you don't care, right? You don't care if someone went to the University of Ottawa and the University of Ottawa made them stupider, as long as they were very, very smart to begin with, right? So we don't care about the selection effects if we're if we're a customer, but if we're a medical educator, you care about that because you want to know what can I bottle and what can I export. And so we re-looked at this and analyzed it with adjustment for what in the US we use are the US MLE exam, United States Medical Licensing Exam, which is typically taken before people get much in the way of residency training program. So that's a marker for how much they knew before their residency program. And what we found was that the ranking distributions were totally unchanged for composite and individual measures. And so, the difference, frankly, in our results was minuscule. So why are there no selection effects? Well, it could be that licensure scores do not reflect aptitude. This was not happy news for the National Board of Medical Examiners, which is in the business of doing those licensing scores. Or perhaps the obstetrical training that's provided by residency programs is far more important. It overcomes any of the differences in aptitude that might exist, or at least residency program, the training dwarfs that. This, to my thinking, is one of the most optimistic messages for medical education, right? Programs matter. What we do with the medical residents in our programs matter. And some programs are much better at it than others. This is, I think, a very optimistic message. So here's the production-oriented question. What is it about some programs that allows them to produce physicians who are consistently better at achieving important patient outcomes? Could we find out what that is? Could we bottle it? Can we export it? The customer-oriented question is actually quite different. Should I choose my obstetrician by where he or she trained? And at this point in time, my answer is yes. And it's not hard to do, right? People put their diploma on the wall, or it's available on the web. Could this research work in other fields? Well, it turns out, and this will come out next week actually, some colleagues of mine, I was not involved in the study, did the same study in general surgery. And they looked at general surgery programs postoperative complications, length of stay, and failure to rescue, which is a measure of in-hospital complications and your ability to recover from those. And the effects were particularly strong in the same direction as I mentioned, and especially for those who graduated within the last 10 years, which makes sense, right? You would expect that the effects of your education would be most prominent shortly after your education, and they would wane over time as experience took over. So this suggests that this kind of work can be done in other fields, and it's incredibly, I think, empowering for all of us as educators. So let's get to the next question. Does experience matter? And I'll say that intuitively, most people seem to think so, right? There's a literature that associates higher volumes with better outcomes. People want experienced physicians. Now, that could be that practice makes perfect, right? It could be that you get better and better from practice, or it could be a kind of reverse causation in which the high-quality doctors get more volume. That could be particularly true in obstetrics because women have some time to make a decision about which obstetrician to choose, and they might be hanging around other people who've delivered babies, and so they might make choices based on quality. So we used years of experience as our measure, years, not the volume of, not the number of babies you delivered, but how many years you've been practicing. Because good quality can lead to you delivering more babies, but it can't make you older. And so that's the model that we use. And so here's what we did. We looked again in New York and Florida, 8.5 million deliveries that we reduced to to about 6.7 million. This reflected almost 55,000 physician years of observation. And then we did some analyses to prevent to at least protect us from the issue of survivor bias, right? If you're an obstetrician and your outcomes aren't so good, you might leave obstetrics, and that would lead you to the false conclusion that short years mean poor quality. So let's pause for a moment and have some audience participation. Here's the question I'm going to pose for you. You need to pick an obstetrician for yourself or for a loved one. And you've got a couple of choices. And I'm going to make everybody vote for one. You can have an obstetrician who is 1 year out of practice, 1 year out of residency. You can have an obstetrician who's been practicing for 5 years, for 10 years, or for 20 years. 1, 5, 10, or 20. How many of you, everyone has to vote. How many of you want the obstetrician who's been practicing for 1 year? Let's have a show of hands. I'm seeing no hands. I see a hand now, thank you. How many want the 5 years? More hands are going up. 10 years. More hands are going up. 20 years. Those are the oldest people in the room, by the way. Do I hear 30 years? Okay, so most of you went for 5 or 10. There were a few who picked 1, a few who picked 20. So here are the results. We see persistent declines in maternal complication rates through 30 years of experience. These are the declines over time for all deliveries and broken down for cesarean deliveries and for vaginal deliveries. And that blue kind of funnel shape reflects our statistical confidence because we have fewer observations in the later years. Obstetricians get better with time, and they just get better and better and better and better, and they don't stop getting better. It's an amazing finding and counterintuitive. The predicted first-year complication rate was 15%. After a decade of experience, this falls by 2%. After another decade, it falls, keeps falling and keeps falling. And these results are robust, whether you look, as I said, at vaginal deliveries, cesarean deliveries, or both. What is it? How is this possible? What is it that an obstetrician learns in their 15th year that they didn't learn in their 12th year? I have no idea what that could be. But it's, I think, in my mind, a really challenging finding for the field of medicine. So here's the production-oriented question. Should we train obstetricians much longer? In the U.S., the residency program is 4 years. I think in the U.S., we're going to make the residency program 30 years. This is going to be the new ACGME requirement. More practically, can we emulate the returns from experience with new training models like coaching? What does this teach us about that? Should we delay lots of, at least in the U.S., lots of obstetrician gynecologists do obstetrics early in their career and gynecology later in their career. Maybe we should switch that, but maybe that would, they don't want to do that, but maybe that would do something bad for gynecology. The customer-oriented question is, should I choose my obstetrician by how long ago he or she trained? Jason Frank just mentioned William Osler. If William Osler, you want Methuselah as your obstetrician, you want the absolute oldest person you can possibly find to deliver your baby. That's something that's observable by customers. So how about initial skill? I'll go through this quickly. Does initial skill matter? If so much of your later quality is determined by your residency program, maybe it's initial skill that offers the most predictive signal. So what we looked at was how well people did in their first year post-training. And again, we looked at hospital deliveries in Florida and New York. We followed we followed physicians over time after their residency. And here's what we found. These are maternal complication rates looking at the worst quartile, the worst performing quartile at the top, and the best performing quartile at the bottom in all three of those graphs. And what you see is over time, the best performing physicians and the worst performing physicians get closer and closer. They approach the mean, but they never quite get there, meaning that the differences persist. So that how you started out as a physician, at least in this field of obstetrics, substantially determines how good you will be for the rest of your career. That's not such an optimistic note, but it says a lot about the mechanics and sort of the production function of medical education, residency education. This just shows those different scores presented a different way. So in summary, training site matters. Where an obstetrician trained is strongly associated with later maternal complication rates. Experience matters. New obstetricians improve steadily with additional years of experience, an effect that almost inexplicably continues through 30 years. But it turns out that initial skill, that last set of results that I just presented, explains more of the between-physician variation than does anything else. Actually, initial skill matters the most. It is, of course, why hospitals often like to be affiliated with training programs, in part because it allows them to pick winners before anybody else can. Lots of limitations for studies like this. Healthcare typically involves teamwork and increasingly involves teamwork. Most physicians take care of patients with many different conditions. Obstetrics is a relatively narrow field. I was incredibly pleased to mention just a few minutes ago that this seems to also work for general surgery. Frequencies of individual diagnoses are typically too low to provide the kind of statistical resolution that you might want. And of course, outcome-based evaluations are delayed. What good is it knowing that the obstetrical residency program at the University of Ottawa was fantastic 15 years ago? You've already had your baby at that point. So let me shift a little bit and go to the conference theme. So this is really about transforming training for modern care. What are the goals, right? The goals for photography were images or shareable images. What are the goals of modern care from a production and output process? And I could think about this from an individual perspective or a population perspective, but these two sides of the two sides of the slide really blend. We want physicians who are trained well. We want physicians who function well. We want patients who are cared for well. We want patients who have good outcomes, getting progressively more distal. We want physicians who are trained less expensively. That's not a clinical outcome, but an economic one. We want patients who are cared for less expensively. On the population side, we want a workforce that's well distributed geographically, a workforce that's well distributed in specialty mix. Those are huge issues in the United States. We want lower cost, better access, population health. Many of these things are in the control of all of you. Many of these things, residency educators have something to say about. Some of them are not, at least in the US. Issues about geographic or specialty distribution of the workforce are not. And I don't think medical educators can be held accountable for that. And here's a reason. This is some work done with some colleagues looking at the economics of specialties in the US. And what I'm showing here is the ratio of debt to income, which is actually a pretty good measure of the economics of becoming a certain kind of doctor. It's a ratio of really how much money you're going to make in your early years of practice with how much you are in the hole getting there. Because, of course, at least in the US, medical education is very expensive. And what you see, higher here is worse. That means that the ratio of debt to income is less favorable for you. Family medicine is at the top of the list. At the bottom, it's radiology and orthopedics in the US are competing for the bottom. They're all going up, but it's worse for family medicine and psychiatry. This is the same slide I didn't do anything but change the scale, and I removed a couple of the specialties. But I did that to show you that there are some other fields that have less favorable debt-to-income ratios. Veterinary medicine in the U.S. in my mind, is facing a catastrophe. Veterinary education is very expensive in the U.S., and it turns out that what people are willing to pay veterinarians is going down. Dental medicine, which is in red there, is actually is not very favorable, and law school does not look very good there either in the U.S. At the bottom, if you can see, is business education, which continues to be an extremely good buy, which is why I'm happy I have an MBA. Actually, I did my MBA at the Wharton School right after residency. I already had an MD, and the fact that I had an MD lowered my salary compared to my classmates. It was actually turned out to be a ball and chain for my salary, but that's okay. I do fine. So the tuition and fees and the cost of producing physicians is closely linked. This is the reason I bring this up is it's closely linked with the income that physicians receive. Again, this is of particular importance in the U.S., but of course these economics are going to exist in all societies and all countries. If physicians make lots of money, then those who are in the business of medical education, let's say medical schools, or those who provide certifying examinations or the like, can actually create toll booths and tax those physicians, effectively extracting future earnings from them. That would be the economic production model. And as physician incomes decline, or decline in relative terms, as they are in certain fields, given that last slide, the money that is available for us to intervene and improve the workforce of the future changes. Medical education's economy is closely tethered to the economy of the physicians we train. And that's a critical thing for us to understand. Again, in the US, there is more and more downward pressure on physician incomes, and I think there will be more and more downward pressure on the kinds of work that medical educators can do. So I think that this is like pushing a string. So many of the population outcomes we care about are determined by how we pay doctors. Again, that is something that often ends at the national borders of a country, because countries differ tremendously in how they finance medical education and how they finance doctors. But medical education fundamentally is a supply-side process. In the US and in other countries, if you try to help people decide what specialty to go into or what geographic region by the medical education system, it's sort of like pushing a string. People go where the opportunities are. That's a demand side issue. And so I think that workforces that are well distributed geographically or distributed in specialty mixes probably aren't the province of transforming residency, at least in the United States. More regulated countries, I think, have more opportunities to do that. So let me shift gears and conclude with some comments about recent developments in the United States. The Institute of Medicine, actually it's now called the National Academy of Medicine in the United States, a kind of august group, recently released a report a little more than a year ago on the governance and financing of residency education, and I had an opportunity to participate on that panel. And these reports, and they issue these things on, and many of you have seen these reports on medical errors or improving quality or health disparities. This report, all of these reports from the Institute of Medicine are meant to be evidence-based. It's a group that gets together and attempts to look at the existing evidence and decide what is it that we need to do to, in this case, improve the financing and governance of residency education. And the central finding, by the way, was that there wasn't much research available. Equally central was the fact that there, in the US, $15 billion of federal financing, which is approximately the price tag of residency education in the US, $15 billion, was never tied to any explicit measurable outcome. And I think that's very much what this conference is about fixing. I think it's incredibly odd, and it's a case of really horrible exceptionalism that this is the case. No one in the US or anywhere questions the need for research to advance our care in cancer, heart disease, or dementia. These are research-intensive areas, and there's tremendous public support for research in cancer, heart disease, or dementia. But residency programs produce the workforce capable of delivering those advances to patients. It's part of the production function for the very outcomes we seek. And yet there is very little organized research infrastructure to support research in all of the things that all of the people in this room do. Very little. And I think that's a shame. How much should go into research and development? It's hard to know, but I would say that in general, if you think about a company, companies should spend money on research and development to the extent they expect to be in business for a long time. And I think we expect to be in business educating physicians for a very long time. On the left are a list of some prominent companies and how much of their revenues they devote to R&D. You see Toyota at 4.2%, Novartis and Roche at 16 or 20%. Pharmaceutical companies put a lot of money into R&D. The average for the top 20 companies is 8.3%. You can do the same thing on the right with different countries. How much of the country's GDP is spent, or the budgets go into R&D expenses. You see South Korea at 3.7%, Japan at 3.7%, China at 2.0%, Canada 1.8%. Even the Czech Republic puts in 1.4% into R&D. There's nothing like that in medical education right now. How much should go into medical education, R&D? Well, in the U.S., the U.S. spends $3 trillion. I should do it like this, like Austin Powers, $3 trillion annually on healthcare. If the U.S. put 1/10 of 1% into medical education R&D, see, look at these percentages, much higher than 1/10 of 1%. That would be $3 billion into medical education. In the U.S., that's about the size of an NIH institute. So this IOM committee recommended that, actually. It recommended that 30% of current graduate medical education financing in the United States, which works out to about $3 billion, should be devoted to developing and sustaining an evidence base capable of leading medical education into the future. I don't know that there's nothing in that IOM report that can happen in the United States without an act of Congress, literally. And those of you who follow American politics know that acts of Congress happen sort of randomly. But I have a sense of optimism that people now have an understanding that we need to invest in medical education for our future. And what a research agenda it would be, right? What outcomes define successful residency programs, and how can they be measured? Who should we be training? What are the best ways of training them, and for how long? What are the substitutes for physicians? What are alternative pathways toward better health? These are all questions that I think are worthy of incredible amounts of our effort. And so I'm going to conclude with optimism about the future of residency education, which is that we have spent the last several decades in the quality sphere getting better at measuring the kind of patient care that we deliver to improve patient outcomes, to improve processes, which we hope will improve future patient outcomes, to find intermediate variables that serve as proxies for much later outcomes. And I think we can follow the same model in residency education using the kinds of techniques of research so that we can get better and better at the outcomes that we care about and think about letting 1,000 flowers bloom. So rediscovering residency, a theme of this conference, I think really offers incredibly, encouraging leadership opportunities in medical education. I'm really excited about the future here, thrilled to have been able to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Bravo. That was outstanding. We have time we have just a few minutes for questions. After we're done here, we're going to have hors d'oeuvres next door, so don't go away. There's mics in the aisles. You must have questions about what you just heard. I heard we have a bit of a ballistic model of medical education where you launch. You didn't mention what happens after the left-hand side of your graph, or the right-hand side of your graph. It's sort of after many years in practice. At what point does it come down again?
Yeah. I guess I don't want to find out, although it's possible I'm already there. But it happens to all of us.
And then you mentioned, $3 billion for medical education research. I think we can handle that. What do you think?
Yeah. We need your votes, I think, for this.
And $3 billion US, that's like 3 trillion Canadian. So that's a lot of research. So come on, we have time for a few questions. There's a number of very thoughtful people, educational researchers, Some of you are both med ed and health services researchers, like David Ash. I want to see people come to the mic. Yes, sir.
Hi, Carlos Felix from Mexico. Congratulations for this great conference. I have just a question, and the question is about the subject that the training place, it matters. Which are the reasons that we can think of that? I mean, the main reasons, probably because it's a very high quality hospital or program, or which are the factors that you can point out to learn from this point?
So David, what's in the box?
Yeah, I would love to know what's in the box. And I think, you know, what we could do, and we have not done this with this particular work, is to go to those programs that have done particularly well. And I think this is an opportunity for qualitative research and try to identify what are the things that these programs are doing that are making them consistently better? Because we would all want to learn from that. Now, we all have our view. We were talking a little bit about this at dinner last night. All have our view that we think it's, you know, the number of cases that you have, or the kinds of facilities that you have, or the kinds of things that we typically evaluate when we evaluate residency programs. And I suspect that that is true. I suspect that the newer models that we have for evaluating education make sense. But I think even more interesting will be the surprises that we might find. We might be completely blown away by realizing that it's the quality of the lunch you serve, or it's giving residents opportunity to exercise, or something that we wouldn't have thought of within our typical curricular model. So I'm incredibly excited about the prospect of people looking inside the box to think about how we can make this better for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
By the way, David, we earlier today in another course, we heard from a program director that once a week, all the residents after their academic half day go running. So maybe that's it. It's exercise.
It may be.
It's the gym. Please.
Laura Davies, University of Calgary. I'm a pediatrician. Thank you very much for your very interesting and reflective talk. I was thinking a bit more about your concept of thinking about what customers want and then health. And I don't see that always as synonymous. So the lists that patients bring in and say, this is what I want, you can go to obstetrics and say, you know, this is my laundry list of everything I want. But that doesn't necessarily equal the outcome that we want, which is health. Can you make some further comments on that?
Yeah, I think we've all had that experience with, you know, I remember when I was doing my pediatrics rotation, and a woman came in with her child, and her chief complaint was, I want moxilactam, which was like a second-generation cephalosporin. And I thought, well, this is a really interesting chief complaint. Rarely do people ask for a particular antibiotic. Her child had otitis and had always received moxilactam, which I don't even think is even made anymore. And there clearly are patients who ask for certain kinds of things that reflect our care processes. But I think that most people, when you drill down or peel away the layers of the onion, whatever the right metaphor is, don't want prescriptions and imaging and surgery. They just communicate that because they see that as the way to communicate something that's on a path to what they fundamentally want, which is they want the lump to be gone or the pain to go away or something like that. So I'll stand by my view that what patients, or what they should want, because I'm an incredibly paternalistic physician, what they should want is what I tell them to want, and that is better health.
Professor Westerberg?
Thank you for your talk. You know, our Royal College goes in every 6 years and accredits our programs across the country. And they tend to look at processes. They tend to look at, do you do this? Do you follow this recipe? We don't really look at outcomes. Do you think there's a role in the accreditation process to look more closely at how we're training, or what kind of product we are producing, if you will?
Yeah, so I do think that there's a role for that. I can't imagine that in a practical sense, it could be an enormous part of what's done with sort of contemporaneous residency evaluation. Because how would you know how your alumni of your program are going to do? You could, of course, evaluate how the residents are taking care of patients right now, but it's in a highly supervised setting, and might likely be, you know, the differences that you see might reflect the differences in the faculty or the attending physicians much more than the residents. I think that the concept of thinking about evaluating residency programs by the outcomes of the alumni is an appealing one to keep us focused. But it's practical, and I don't mean to take the wind out of my own sails here, but it's practical application for evaluating residencies right now when you have to make decisions is a challenge. It does seem to me to speak to the issue of how you would design the intermediate outcomes that you can measure in real time. Maybe we could look for what are the correlates that are associated with the later outcomes, the more important outcomes that we care about. In the way that hypertension doesn't cause any symptoms now, we use hypertension as an intermediate outcome, a risk factor for stroke and heart disease and kidney disease later.
That's a great question. So you might be happy to know we've started an international accreditation outcomes research group. And the ACGME, many of whom are members are here today from the US, are world leaders in looking at that area. Please.
Hi there. One thing that I thought was very interesting was defining our industry. We often talk about healthcare, but it's actually largely what we do with our day is disease care. And I think even that's the first thing in the discussion is just actually shifting back to health, which kind of brings us into health advocacy, which is focused on health and is kind of the CanMed's role that we struggle with the most. It's where like the ACGME leaves it behind because it's just so difficult to address. You had another slide where you said looking at the outcomes based on patient characteristics, the physician, and system resources. So we've been so focused on that physician that population studies tell us is probably like somewhere around 10%. And those other factors that are largely addressed by health advocacy, we haven't been focusing so much. So I think in some ways for me, listening to this, it was much more, even though it's outcome oriented, it's this need to somehow address health, the determinants of health, and figuring out ways that we can actually make health advocacy work. Because health advocacy is about changing the system and changing outcomes. Like you said, that it was very interesting talk.
Thank you. I completely agree. One of the reasons I opened with the example from Downton Abbey and the like is that I am a firm believer that health is determined socially to a tremendous extent. I would love to see more people, I would like to see a blending of medical education and public health education. We're of course seeing more and more of that, but I think often the kinds of activities that physicians can engage in at the level of the public may ultimately do the most for their patients. In the US, it turns out that physicians are among the least frequent voters, right? Physicians are extremely unlikely to vote in the US.
We're always busy and tired.
But the lawyers are busy and tired too, and they vote.
That's true.
So it's a personal disappointment that we don't have more. And it seems to me that voting is a tiny amount of public participation. Physicians have so much more to give in terms of those social determinants.
Cool. Professor Scheel.
Thanks for a fantastic lecture. I was most intrigued by the fact that you discovered that the longer experience in obs and gynae would give you more competence in this field, so it gives me some more self-confidence. But I was asking myself the question, why should that happen? And I could think that it might be because you get immediate feedback. So you see when you have done the job, the mother and the child, and you know what you have done wrong or what you have done good. And that might be translated to other ways of training and other fields of training, making sure that the outcome of the treatment will be fed back to the team or even better to the persons that have treated. What's your idea about that as a potential?
Well, I think the issue of feedback is so interesting because there are, of course, a lot of professions in medicine where you don't actually get a lot of feedback. Sometimes you refer patients off to other specialists and you never really hear back what happens. In emergency medicine, that's a perfect example where you throw people out into the void, hopefully well-armed to go there, and you may not learn what happens. And obstetrics is probably one of those fields in which you do get feedback. So I'm a big fan of feedback as of course, we're all taught to give appropriate feedback to our trainees, our residents, and our medical students. What I don't understand is, after 15 years of feedback, what more am I going to learn? How much more feedback is going to make a difference? And yet it seemed to make a difference. So feedback is good, but you'd think enough already after a while.
Thank you. Professor Strasser.
Yeah, hi, I'm Roger Strasser. I'm the Dean of the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. And I'm thinking about your presentation and starting with health outcomes and sort of working backwards. So focusing our education and training the system on improving the health of the people. And in my mind, that's social accountability. And all of the medical schools of Canada have committed a long time ago to achieving social accountability. We have in Northern Ontario, with the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, I guess a working model. The school opened 10 years ago, and in a situation where the model of education is for our learners, our residents and our medical students to be learning in community and clinical settings from the people, from the communities, about the health. So it seems to me that the black box bit is actually being, just as the focus is on the health, ultimately it's the people and their health that should be driving the learning. And at least in our situation, and it's early days, but in Northern Ontario, small numbers and all that, but seems to be working. So roughly 70% of the graduates of our residency programs are practicing in Northern Ontario. If you put together those who graduated from our MD program and then did their residency in Northern Ontario, 94% of them are practicing in Northern Ontario in community and clinical settings which were previously underserved. And it does seem to fit with your outcomes about skills, location, geographic distribution, and also specialty mix as well. So I'm interested in your comments on that.
Yeah, well, thank you for those comments, and I'm encouraged by what you just said. I like the term social accountability, and I think that, you know, this is an incredible profession here, and it's a privilege, and it is an obligation. In the United States, the University of Wisconsin started a project with some funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in which they are providing county health ratings. So every state is divided into, you know, many, many counties. And these are ratings of the community health. And it could be everything from life expectancy to measures that we think might be associated with health, you know, gun violence in the area, numbers of liquor stores, school test scores, which you wouldn't necessarily think of as a health outcome, but clearly a kind of social accountability outcome. And I think that the measurement task that they started with is a critically important one, because unless we start measuring these issues, we can never be accountable for it. And I think we absolutely should be holding our schools of medicine, our schools of nursing, our schools of pharmacy, our hospitals to those kinds of measures. That is what the public trust is about. And I think we can put that at the level of patients, and we think we can put it at the level of communities. They require different activities. But I mean, thank you for your comments. I'm incredibly encouraged by them, and I wish there was more of that thinking.
So we're going to take just two more questions. I'm going to ask the speakers to be very brief. And Dr. Lamke.
Lamke from Oman. I am extremely excited about your research, and I think there's the great need for research of the type that you've said. But what you have shown us mostly is the outcome of experience. To me, I would like to see immediately the outcome immediate out of the training in the first year, say, what you started with the first year, and that compared to the input criteria, how those residents were chosen and how they came out at the end. To me, that is a means of seeing how good the training would be. And I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah.
Secondly, just just as a comment, I think one way to encourage people to do research is people who have the purse, like NIH, should invite. They invite a lot of research on cancer, on this, on that, and why they don't invite people and put out invitations on research on medical education.
Well, I'll take your second comment first by just saying I totally agree. Why doesn't NIH fund more of this? And they do fund some, but really it's a drop in the bucket, and I think they should do more. And as for your first question, I think it's a great research question. What are the inputs to that initial quality, and can we measure that? And there were some hints of that in the kinds of in the demonstration that initial skill seems to be an incredibly important determinant of later ability. But left unanswered, what was it that got people to that initial skill? I think your question is great also because it speaks to the fact that we need to identify earlier and more immediate measures of the quality later on, because we can't evaluate residency programs and transform residency education as fast as we want if we have to wait 20 years for every cycle. Our needs can't wait for that kind of cycle length. We need to find more immediate measures for whether we're doing this right or in ways that can be improved.
We have time for one last question. I'm very sorry, but I'm going to take this gentleman over here. This will be our last question, and maybe the rest of you can grab Dr. Ash if you're willing to stay around for a few minutes next door at the break. Sure. That'd be great. Sir. Just over here, guys.
Let me repeat the question because I'm not sure that people could hear it. It was about next steps in research and what are the kinds of what are the next steps for this research, and what are the kinds of processes, political and otherwise, that might inform what happens with education. At least that's my summary of the question. Well, as I mentioned, I think it would be great. I'm not sure that I'm the one to do it. Would be great for people to look inside the box and figure out what is it that is bottleable and exportable that exists. But I also think that this is really in response to the second part of the question. One of the most exciting things in my mind about residency education is how rapidly it is being transformed. And so it is a little bit about studying something that is moving so fast that almost every research, every study you do is almost historical by the time you're done. That's why residency education is such an exciting field. There is so much, I mean, this is going to sound like a cliche, but everyone's got a cell phone. Everyone has access to, frankly, most residents will have smartphones, have access to a wealth of information that's just in time. I think that might tremendously transform the kinds of things that we expect throughout the continuum of medical education, where we might in the end be moving much more to continuing medical education activities and get physicians out of the door sooner. I have no idea if what I said makes sense. I think those are models that we could potentially test going forward. Everyone's interested in interdisciplinary education. Everyone recognizes that healthcare is a team sport. There really are no solo athletes except in very, very few fields. I think the field of interdisciplinary education is embryonic right now, and there are enormous opportunities for that as well. So I think the field is wide open. If we could just get NIH and a couple of other agencies, whether they're US-based or foundation-based or based in other countries, recognizing more so than they already do, that if we want good health and health care for our populations, we need to invest not just in understanding cancer biology, but also we need help in understanding what creates the very doctors who can apply that cancer biology to the patients who suffer from cancer today. Thank you so much.
I'll call on our president once again, Dr. Kevin Emery, to present a certificate. And Professor Ash, we're so glad you were here with us. Not only are you a great dancer, scholar, clinician, charming human being, your research really, I think, is so apropos. And the biggest message I've taken from this is that residency training really, really matters. Thank you.